How you doing, folks? So it has been a long time since I've spoken directly into the camera like this by myself. It's been a very busy couple of months, which is why I haven't managed to be able to do these solo videos on the channel in conjunction with the Huddle Breakdown. Since the start of the year, I've had 2 house moves and a new job move, so I just have not had the time to put together these solo videos on the channel as well. But much like Brendan Rodgers, they're coming back. I promise you, they're coming back shortly, and across the summer and across next season, I will be dedicating more time to doing these videos alongside the Huddle Breakdown on these channels. Now, for this week's podcast on the Huddle Breakdown, we could have brought you an hour worth of dissection of Brendan Rodgers' first press conferences, and we might still do that over the next couple of weeks if we do find the time. But I have been promising to bring you this interview for the last month or so. We haven't managed to get to it because of the Ange news, because of the Rodgers news. There was too much to cover that was happening day to day within Celtic. But this week, I'm bringing you it. It is the Kieran Maguire interview. It's an interview about finances, how Celtic's finances are, how Rangers' finances are, and where Scotland now lies within the grander scheme of Europe, and how far Celtic have to go to narrow the gap between themselves and Europe, and how far the gap is between Celtic and Rangers. So very interesting stuff from Kieran Maguire. Kieran is the host of the Price of Football podcast. If you want to listen to more of his stuff, this interview was recorded probably almost exactly a month ago. It was the last game of the season in the Premier League. He was heading off to Brighton. So it was about a month ago since we recorded this, and just so much has happened in between that we haven't been able to bring it, but it's all still relevant. But if there is some references in there that seem a little bit old, that's why. It's because it's been recorded about a month ago. But it's here today, and if you like it, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel as well if you're not already subscribed. So without further ado, here is the Kieran Maguire conversation. This is the Huddle Breakdown. Enjoy. Now we're going to do something a little different on today's show. We're going to be talking about financing in the Scottish League. And to do so, I'm very happy to say that Kieran Maguire from the Price of Football podcast has joined us. Kieran, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for the invite, guys. Looking forward to this. Should be fun.
Yeah, I know you have to be away for the Brighton game very shortly, so I thought I'd say you're very welcome for the gift that Ireland has given you in Evan Ferguson.
Yeah, and I'm also grateful for him having an English mum, because without that, under the post-Brexit arrangement, Brighton wouldn't have been able to sign him. So God bless his mum. And may he play in green. And I think, judging from what he said to date, I don't think there's any chance of him having second thoughts and doing a Jack Grealish or a Declan Rice. With those circumstances, I think in terms of their background, were very different there.
No, he's very much going to play for Ireland, and he has done so. He will be playing for Ireland in the future. But we're not here to talk about Brighton or Evan Ferguson or Ireland, as much as I'd love to do that for the next 45 minutes. We're here to talk about Scottish football and financing, Celtic, Rangers, all the good stuff. And I thought probably the best place to start here, Kieran, is where Scottish football is in the world of football when it comes to financing, because Celtic and Rangers are obviously the powerhouses in Scotland. They're big fish in a small pond. But as we've seen in Europe this year in the Champions League, they're very much small fish in a big pond globally now. And that would be a hard truth for a lot of Scottish football fans and Celtic and Rangers fans, for where Celtic were 20 years ago to where they are now. Can you maybe just give us some insight into where the two clubs are and where Scottish football stands in the world of football in terms of the financing side of things?
Yeah, if we go back to the commencement of the Premier League in 1992, I think Rangers had the second or third highest revenues, and certainly the second or third highest wage bill in English and Scottish football, and Celtic were probably about 7th or 8th. If we fast track to 2022, Celtic have revenue of 88 million, Rangers had revenue of 87 million, and that's with both clubs participating in Europe. The club which generated the least amount of money in the Premier League generated around about 130. So there has been a change. I think you're absolutely right to say that the clubs are between a rock and a hard place in the sense that if you compare the two clubs from Glasgow to the rest of Scotland, if you look at the total value of the squads in the Scottish Premiership, between them, Rangers and Celtic have got 96% of the total spend. If you look at the total revenues, again, it far outweighs that of other clubs. You've got clubs in the Premiership who are paying wages on average of about perhaps £1,000, perhaps £1,200 a week. Rangers and Celtic far exceed that. At the same time, the wage bills are high by Scottish standards, low compared to England. I still think they're quite competitive, perhaps compared to some of the other clubs that you'll be playing against, certainly in the Champions League, and certainly competitive to most of the clubs in the Europa League, with the exception of probably the English clubs and those clubs who fall out of the Champions League by finishing third. We've seen Barcelona and Manchester United and so on in the Europa League this season. So it is it's a challenge. That there's not a Goldilocks position, in the sense that I think it could be argued that the two clubs from Glasgow are probably too big for Scotland, but not big enough to make a dent in the Champions League. But then you could say, well, hold on, let's settle for making progress in the Europa League, and that has been achieved historically.
Yeah, because that was going to be my follow-up question. Is it fair to say that the two clubs are probably in a very unique position in the world of football? Because if you look at, you probably have to look at some of the Eastern European clubs to find a club that are so domestically huge and even commercially, globally huge, like Celtic and Rangers, but they're far too big for the league that they're currently playing in every metric, be that on the pitch and off the pitch, but they're not nearly big enough and on a world market to make a dent. But again, like you said, it's sort of a rock and a hard place, because how do you make progress outside of your own pond with the shackles off your own pond?
Yeah. I agree with you entirely. Yeah, they both have substantial fan bases, both domestically and internationally in pockets. If you look at France, PSG again is a dominant player as far as the league is concerned, but also has the benefit of extremely wealthy owners who have managed to elevate that club. There was no football in France 30 or 40 years ago to a large extent. PSG were a non-entity until they were acquired by Qatar. So it is a case, and then perhaps it's a case of saying, well, hold on, where do we want these clubs to be? We know for the foreseeable future going forwards, one of the two is going to win the Scottish Premiership. And if they want to make a contribution, if they want to challenge in Europe, we don't see clubs from Austria making progress. We don't see clubs from Sweden making progress. But they do sometimes do pretty reasonably as far as the Europa League is concerned. So I know as Celtic fans, you probably don't want to hear this, but Rangers did make the final. It was a good progress a couple of years ago when they got to the final in Seville. And is that an achievement in its own right? At the same time, accepting that as far as the Champions League is concerned, the clubs realistically should have an objective of trying to finish third in the group stages and then drop down into the Europa League and have a bit of fun there.
I think most Celtic fans would probably put that as a reasonable objective, or especially did this year anyway. But can we focus now a little bit on Celtic, and I'll bring in James now, who's on the podcast as well, because where Celtic stand, at least on the outlook, is a very healthy position based on their books from the last couple of years. But James, I know you wanted to come in on the reality of the situation and maybe explain in more context about the books that Celtic have released over the last number of years and why you think they might not be as strong as they are putting outwardly.
Yeah, my criticism has been more within the context of Kieran's comments relative to making that leap in Europe to be a relevant kind of late Europa League challenger on a consistent basis. Kind of a pot three Champions League performer. Maybe once in a while making it into the knockout stages of the Champions League. Maybe 1 out of 5 years, that kind of thing. And it, my background, Kieran's in financial markets. So as an accountant, the importance of benchmarking. And my main criticism of Celtic has been the relative decline in competitiveness in Europe, and really it's the player trading model that differentiates the clubs that have advanced to kind of punch above their weight, so to speak. And that's where Celtic, if you benchmark domestically, they look like they're geniuses in player trading. But then if you look at them within the context of the broader European landscape, whether it's even a club as small as Alkmaar, to the big boys like Benfica and Porto and Ajax that have a lot of institutional advantage and culture, recruiting out of certain markets, that kind of thing. So that's more so. But I wanted to, and this does lead to a question. Relative to your comments on this, I call it kind of a duopoly. It's almost like a feudal state in Scottish football. There's no middle class. Even in France, you have some clubs that you could argue, yes, it's very skewed to PSG, but you have a middle class there that are fairly wealthy clubs in the grand scheme of things. But in Scotland, it's very much a duopoly. What does that present from a resource perspective and a competitive landscape in recruiting players, in being able to market the league on a commercial basis outwardly, whether it's because that's one of the big criticisms that a lot of Scottish football fans have, and particularly Celtic fans, is the media rights. And that's really the lever. I mean, that's what's changed the economics of football since, 20 years ago, is that the amount of growth in media rights. So how do you put that in context financially as far as this feudal system without, any real middle class in clubs within Scotland?
I think you've summed it up perfectly in the sense that we have the two leading clubs, and then effectively there is nothing. And to a certain extent, perhaps it could be likened to what we've seen in post-Soviet Russia, in that there is wealth concentrated in the hands of a very few. Then there's a huge gap, and then we have the day-to-day folks. And that has a ripple effect in terms of things such as media rights. If I'm watching broadcast TV, would I watch Leeds versus Nottingham Forest? Yes, I would, because they are the middle class of English football, and you tend to have some skin in the game. Whereas we notice who's going to watch St Johnstone versus Kilmarnock, apart from those St Johnstone and Kilmarnock fans that can't get to the game. As Rangers and Celtics fans, you would not be watching it because they're not a threat. You might have a vague interest in relegation. Relegation in England is a huge issue because if Leicester get relegated this weekend, they're going to lose 2/3 of their income because of what you then referred to, the broadcasting rights. And I do another podcast, and we're actually interviewing Neil Doncaster tomorrow, and we've got quite a few questions sent in from listeners, the vast majority of which refer to the commercialization of the game, the monetization of the broadcasting rights. Nothing in terms of how that money is distributed, because I think the clubs in the main, I think the fans accept the distribution model. But how do I, when I talk to people in marketing, so I have the conversations. And for people that know me, I'm a teacher at university, and I work with marketing professors and so on. And I somehow sort of schlep a living by pretending that football finance is a proper subject when we all know that it isn't really. But they say to me that there is a problem in that Scottish football doesn't have an own brand, an own identity. The two Glasgow clubs do, and then there's a bit of a void. And if you're trying to sell the whole product, I think it is challenging for the SPFL. And yes, we know that there are outposts of Scottish fans all around the world, but there's not huge numbers of them in order to attract significant revenues from international rights. Whereas you've got the Premier League is now the dominant player in that market. You've got interest in La Liga because of the impact of Real Madrid and Barcelona, and also we have quite a few countries with large Hispanic populations. And then you've got the issue of, well, how are the players going to come through? And I think you sort of alluded to the fact that there are issues in terms of the attitude towards sport as part of young people's development in countries such as Belgium and the Netherlands and Portugal, which isn't replicated in Scotland and in England, I'll be honest. And that gives those countries an advantage. And then you're playing catch up. And I'm looking at my figures here in respect of Celtic. The last 13 years, Celtic made a loss in those years from day-to-day operations, and then they had to rely on the player trading model to make money, and that is their modus operandi. Sell one player a year, make a loss, probably somewhere in the region of 10 to 20 million a year in terms of operations. And your player sales will dig you out of that. But it does mean, of course, that you are under pressure to sell probably your best or your second best player every season. And that's going to have a negative impact upon the club's ability to progress at the upper echelons in Europe.
So to get in a little bit more of a thornier topic, the three of us all enjoyed your joke on Twitter about the 60,000 financial experts in Glasgow, or at least one half of Glasgow. And as Alan's fond of saying, that what makes that a good joke is there's always an element of truth to it. And segueing from this idea of a duopoly, there's you as a Brighton fan and not eating and breathing and sleeping this topic over the last 20 years. So some of the context there is because of the power structure in Scottish football, and both clubs being punitive towards journalists at times, and questions about governance, and almost, I joke, a mutually assured destruction. You're of an age vintage like Alan and I, where you probably remember hiding under your school desk in drills, right? So there's an element of that within Scottish football, meaning that without another big club, the financial sustainability of the league, comes into picture. And that leads me to my question, which is, when you go back to the liquidation of Rangers in 2012, I think a lot of the disgruntlement amongst Celtic supporters derives from the lack of I'll call it investigative journalism that took place. And a lot of it was actually, cited by Celtic supporters and a grievance of having, feel kind of cheated out of the financial aspect of what had taken place preceding that. But my question is more nuanced to that, because there's also been criticism of the Celtic board at that time, in maybe not being as aggressive in pursuing certain things. And that's been a legacy issue within the elements of the Celtic support. But one of the distinctions between the two clubs, and particularly the new iteration of Rangers, is Celtic being a public company. Can you speak to what that means relative to the fiduciary role of a board of directors, of a chairperson, and those topics of what would the Scottish League look like coming out of a liquidated Rangers, and how that might play into that. If I'm a person that has a fiduciary role in a public company that could get sued for violating that, I might address something differently than if I was a private company, maybe certainly diametrically opposed to, let's say, supporters that might have a more aggressive posture.
Yeah, I mean, for the sake of transparency, I'm a shareholder in Celtic. So I do monitor the club. I'm a lecturer. I'm not a lawyer, but as an executive of a listed company, you do have responsibilities towards stakeholders, especially the broader shareholder base. And I'm sure Celtic will have taken legal counsel. Ultimately, you can't turn back time. And I think those fans who felt that some of the trophies that were won by Rangers should have been removed from them, that's something I don't see happening elsewhere. There's even we've got Manchester City currently with 115 charges. Liverpool fans, Manchester United fans, Spurs fans are very unhappy about that. But they don't realistically expect any changes with regards to that. In terms of the opportunities for the directors, I think it could have been costly, and you might have got a symbolic victory here and there. But my argument would be that I'd rather the money would have been spent on infrastructure. The money would rather have been spent on talent recruitment, developing facilities, in order for Celtic going forwards to be competitive in Europe. Again, as an outsider, I felt that what happened to Rangers was to a certain extent a lost opportunity for Celtic, because if I'd been there, I would have tried to expand the facilities even further, get another 5,000 fans in, get a load more opportunities for hospitality tickets and so on, and ensure that the club was in a position that the Rangers have been in a recovery phase, but they would have to recover from a long way back, and Celtic would be so far ahead that they'd be almost uncatchable. So instead of and you talk about duopoly, I think Rangers came back because the duopoly was achievable. Celtic perhaps missed an opportunity to make it a monopoly. And I'm not saying a monopoly in football is good. I'm not saying a duopoly in football is good. But if I've got an advantage, there's a case for putting on the afterburners and just getting so far ahead as to make the challenge for Rangers nigh on impossible.
Yeah. You mentioned Manchester City there. We might come back to that topic in just 1 minute, but I want to bring Alan in as well, because he's been very quiet in the corner over there. Can we talk about what you're sort of mentioning there and the gap between the two clubs? Because on purely football terms, Celtic are miles ahead at the minute in this season. A couple of years ago, you could have said that Rangers were miles ahead. That was flipped on its head. It turns very quickly on the pitch in Scotland. But you said earlier on the podcast that the revenue for the clubs, Celtics is 88 million, Rangers is around 87 million. Is the gap really that marginal? Is that how close the two clubs are financially, in your opinion?
I think the gap is wider. Remember, here we are looking at the 2022 figures. Now, in season 21-22, Rangers did benefit from getting to the final of the Europa League. They've not done that this year, so I would expect that gap to grow, but it has narrowed. If we go back to 2018, for example, Celtic again were in the Champions League that season. Their revenues were 102, and Rangers were 32. So we've gone from a gap of almost 70 million pounds to almost being eliminated. Now, that was eliminated as a consequence of circumstance. First of all, Rangers had a good 21 and they had a good 22 internationally. Celtic have the advantage of a bigger stadium, B, I think greater experience of the player trading model, which I think Rangers are trying to replicate, and that's they have utilised that in the past. So all of the ducks were in the right line for Rangers in 2022. They had a modest 2023. They didn't get any points as far as the Champions League is concerned. They're behind Celtic as far as the UEFA 10-year coefficient is concerned. So I'd expect that gap to grow, probably back to double figures in terms of millions when we see the accounts being announced for both clubs.
So just thanks, Kieran. And yeah, by the way, I completely agree with you about the wasted opportunity at Celtic over the last 10 years. But just want to build up that story really about the potential gap between the two clubs, and then I want to, if it's okay, move back to Europe, because I think this word that I think is vital is sustainability. That's the cornerstone of UEFA current financial legislation, and I think it's an important word to have in our minds when we talk about Scottish football, especially given the revenue challenges that we face. But coming back to the sort of what is the gap? How do we articulate that gap between the top two in Scotland? I don't know if you know David Lowe. David Lowe was one of Fergus McCann's key people when he took over Celtic in '94. He was in the room when all of that business was done. He's a respected business person in Scotland and is intimately familiar with the workings of both sides of the divide in Glasgow and knows many of the people involved. He tweeted recently that he sees that Celtic have got what he classified as a 50 million year on year advantage over their rivals. And as you rightly said, a lot of that's driven by number of season book sales. That then allows you to generate more match day income because obviously you've got more people spending match day money for all the games that you play. And then the third big gap is commercial performance, where I think I've got the spreadsheets that you've got up on your screen, I might have screen grabbed the same ones. Celtic have got like a sort of 10 million current advantage on that. And I know you were on a Sports Sound podcast with Tom English and Kenny McIntyre recently, and you said that Celtic had a wee advantage. I like the vernacular that you used there. But given that 15 million a year, and it's every year and it's repeating currently, represents 17% of Celtic's revenue, in the context of Scottish football, where I know Brighton have probably got at least 10 players in their squad that cost £15 million, but Celtic don't have any. £15 million is an awful lot of money in the context of Scottish football. Would you agree with that? And therefore, would you consider that gap as actually quite considerable gap as a year-on-year challenge?
I think Rangers are having to play catch up, and Celtic start the season in a stronger position. I was on a Rangers podcast a couple of weeks ago, and they acknowledged on the pitch and off the pitch they are behind Celtic, and we were discussing how do you address that. Rangers have had a period of time when they weren't in a position to invest in facilities, and they are trying projects. They have had distractions off field in terms of litigation issues. Again, that's all money coming out of the club. So yes, Celtic are ahead of Rangers. Whether it's 15 million, I think we're arguing semantics, because I know when I speak to Rangers, and again, for the sake of complete transparency, I've had John Bennett on my show. I know Stuart Robertson. We talk, and because my background's in finance, and they're quite open, and they say, well, we know that Celtic have got the capacity advantage, their hospitality facilities. They've got an advantage there because Celtic have continued to invest. And I think they say, well, when it comes to commercial Rangers but Rangers kit deal is that Rangers get a commission, whereas Celtic are looking at the gross figures. So if you look at those two numbers, it's difficult to compare, because ultimately it's the net that really matters. But yes, it is a substantial advantage. It's not a killer advantage though. And I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, I felt that Celtic could have expanded Celtic Park to 65,000. They could have put in a CEO. I talk to. I'm fortunate in this job that I do is that I get to talk to lots of clubs all around, and Bayern Munich's tell me that they make as more money from the 6,000 corporate seats that they do from the 60,000 that turn up at the Alliance. And could Celtic have done that? Glasgow is not the same as Munich in terms of a fundamentally wealthy city, but Celtic can leverage upon the historic links and so on to make it very attractive. Under the owner, I think Celtic have been quite conservative, and there's a lot to be said for that, because the alternative to being conservative in football is gambling, and Rangers ended up in liquidation, as you say. They've had to go and pay the price for that. Certainly here, what I'm seeing in England, clubs in the English Championship have gambled, trying to get into the Premier League, have broken financial fair play rules. Some of them have ended up being relegated into the third tier. So I can understand Fergus McCann taking that approach. And the legacy of that means that and I think I was quoted as saying this 2 or 3 years ago, if Rangers have one good year, that gap will be eliminated. And we've seen that. Has it been eliminated for 1 year? Yes. Will it be eliminated on a regular basis? I think not, unless they recruit those 2 or 3 players that get them into the Champions League. And then, if they get into the knockout phases 2 years in a row, that resets their budget. So that would be my observation.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the commercials there. I just wanted to explore, because obviously, one of the levers that they have is to grow their commercial operations to try and catch up with Celtic or exceed Celtic. I just wondered, because I know on your Price of Football, excellent Price of Football podcast, I've heard you, I think, mention the fact that obviously you operate in these circles. It's like any global business. It's actually a village when you come down to it. The key people who operate within that. So I'm thinking really here about the commercial world of football, especially sort of kit manufacturers and so forth. And if you go through the list of litigations that you mentioned there, Sports Direct, Hummel, Elite, the people that built the Memorial Wall, Park Hamilton, the Sydney Super Cup, organisers, Sinch, Glenn's Vodka, the list goes on and on. It's almost, from an outsider's perspective, it almost seems that every commercial partner that club has, they end up in court with. I just wanted to get your observation on what does all of that activity mean from a reputational perspective, and therefore how easy will it be to grow commercials given that background?
I think it would mean that I would be cautious if I was coming from the commercial sector or a sponsorship sector, because you do your due diligence. Rangers have had a lot of, I said that Fergus McCann is a very conservative approach, but it's also quite a serene boardroom. That's not been the case at Rangers. There have been disputes with partners such as Mike Ashley, and Mike Ashley is a controversial figure, but he's not somebody that I'd pick a fight with unless I had a cast iron case, because he's. I think people see the character and they make judgments on him. He's a much smarter operator than he's given credit for. They've got the issues with Dave King, who now is sort of, to a certain extent, the equivalent of Boris Johnson, in the sense that he was the man in charge. He's not the man in charge, and he's trying to make some things awkward for the people that have superseded him. And that means that, in my observation, where Rangers should be focusing on is building up the commercial side, is building up the football side, and they've got these distractions, and that's not in the interests of the club, and that again gives Celtic an advantage. Now, how Celtic choose to deal with that advantage is down to them.
Sure. So just I know we're running short of time, so I wanted to cover really the European landscape as regards financial regulation, because again, this is a topic again, and it comes back to your joke about 60,000 financial experts. The reason that we have to cover this is because the Scottish Press really doesn't. So for the benefit of listeners, could you just briefly explain, what financial sustainability regulations (FSR) are in terms of? I'm really thinking of three things. Sorry, really. One is mechanically, what is it? Secondly, what's it trying to do? What's the spirit of it? What's it actually trying to achieve? And thirdly, how do you see it impacting on Scottish football?
We are moving away from having a break-even model. Under the historic rules in UEFA, you were allowed to have an FFP loss of 30 million euro over a rolling 3-year period, but actually it wasn't 30 million. It was 5 million, and then the owners were allowed to top that up with 25 million pounds worth of equity in 25 million euro of equity investment. Financial fair play profit was not the same as accounting profit. And I know when the rules came out, I just looked at them, and I spent one evening and I wrote down 10 ways. Apologies here. I used to teach creative accounting on Wall Street, and Canary Wharf, and for me, because I'm an academic, I wasn't working there full time. I go across in the summer and say, "Hey guys, have you seen this crazy scheme?" So therefore, I know how to play with the numbers, and I'm thinking, well, if I can do that, and I'm just a teacher, then you've got really smart people at the firms of accountants, at the law firms, at the investment banks who will run rings around these figures. But that's where we were. The new financial and sustainability rules are wage based. You're now allowed to lose 60 million over 3 years, but I don't think that'll provide much focus. And in the first year, you're allowed to spend 90% of your revenue on wages, agents' fees, and net transfer cost. So here, I think Celtic having that player trading model will come to their benefit. And that 90% then becomes 80% and then becomes 70%. And that's UEFA's long-term aim, that player wages plus agents' fees plus your net transfer cost, however they're going to define that, can't be more than 70% of revenue. Now, we've had this position where Rangers have been cited in terms of, we come out of COVID, but you're not in a great position. Chelsea have been given the same. About 4 or 5 clubs in England. I think there's a list of between 25 to 30 clubs in Europe, and there's some pretty big players in that. And Rangers were one of those. So that does give them less room to manoeuvre. And clearly they've had a poor season in terms of their Champions League performance, but they qualified for the Champions League in the first place. And that had both benefits and costs. So I know. I'm a Brighton fan. We sold Connor Goldson to Rangers, and we had a clause in the contract which said if Rangers qualify for the Champions League, we get an add-on. So they get the more money coming in, but they got more money going out. The players would have been on bonuses and so on. Rangers are not in a brilliant position with regards to that. But I don't think that they're in a terrible position either, because there are so many other clubs, and this is very much a case of Rangers giving they sort of been given just watch yourself, guys. Yeah. But it's not disastrous.
I'll just wrap this up then, just for time's sake. Before we finish up overall, can I just ask, adding a layer onto this UEFA sustainability thing, if you're on the topic of playing catch up with Celtic, if you look at clubs across Europe who have played catch up with each other, Juventus are one. They were doing some creative accounting and have been deducted 10 points. Barcelona have pulled 150 million levers in order to keep the club afloat. Is there a danger now that perhaps Rangers playing catch up year on year because of the advantages that we've spoken about, that there could be a little bit of a worry there within their financials?
My gut reaction is no. I do know John Bennett. I do know Stuart Robertson. I appreciate Stuart's moving on. I think that they are aware of the level of scrutiny that their activities, and also whatever you want to think about the people that they're historically, the impression I get is that these guys are actually quite professional, and therefore they're not. And I think they'd rather take the brickbats from the Rangers fans, and they're getting those brickbats at present, than jeopardise the future of the club.
Kieran, I know you have to go, so I shall let you go and watch your beloved Brighton. But thanks very much for joining us on the show, and maybe we can catch up again over the summer and discuss this even further.
Well, thank you very much for the invite, guys. Have a good summer yourselves, and stay healthy, and look after your loved ones. Bye-bye.